before names existed, before the idea of gods had learned how to speak. There was already a place beneath the world. You are not entering sleep yet. You are arriving. Above you, the forests of the Slavic lands still breathe in an ordinary way. Trees sway. Roots drink slowly from the dark. Animals move without knowing the age of the ground they walk on. But you are not staying there. You step away from the surface without leaving it behind. The earth opens not suddenly, not violently, but as if it has always been waiting for you to notice the way down. A narrow passage forms between roots. The air changes first, cooler, older, not empty, just quieter. This is not an underworld of judgment, not a realm of fire or punishment. This is a place of storage, of memory held gently. Each step downward feels less like movement and more like remembering something you never learned. Stone appears where soil ends, smooth in places, rough in others, as if time itself has been touching it without hurry. Water gathers along the walls, not dripping, not flowing, just present. Listening. Far below, something vast exists, but it does not call to you. It does not demand attention. It simply remains. The deeper you go, the quieter language becomes. Thoughts do not disappear. They thin, like mist settling close to the ground. This is the layer where old agreements were made, between earth and animal, between root and bone, between what grows and what returns. Long before gods were imagined, this place already worked. You reach a widening chamber. The ceiling is lost in shadow, but not because it is high, because distance matters less here. The floor feels firm beneath you, held, supported. At the center of this chamber, the quiet deepens. Not silence, something heavier, steadier. This is where Veles is felt, not seen, not as a figure, not as a voice, but as a function, keeper of what descends, guardian of what returns to the soil, the patience that waits beneath every ending. Here, nothing is rushed, nothing is forced upward or pushed away. Fur, bone, leaf, memory, everything arrives when it is ready. The chamber breathes in its own way. Not lungs, not air, but pressure easing, settling, balancing. You are allowed to be here because you are not trying to take anything. Around the edges of the chamber, smaller paths branch away. Some lead deeper. Some curve sideways, following underground streams. Some simply stop, holding stillness like a sealed jar. You do not choose yet. This first place is only the threshold, a reminder that before stories were told, before names were carved into wood and stone, the world already knew how to be quiet without being empty. The surface feels very far away now, not lost, just irrelevant. Time behaves differently here. Minutes loosen, edges soften. You remain standing, but effort has faded from the idea of standing. Gravity feels cooperative, supportive. Somewhere deeper, roots are thinning into threads. Water is collecting into wider darkness, and the quiet is preparing another layer for you, but For now, you are simply here, at the entrance to the deep Slavic world, before gods, before conflict, before stories needed endings. The descent will continue. The chamber does not close behind you. It simply becomes less important. You move forward, and the ground changes in a way that cannot be measured. Stone gives way to something older than stone, compressed layers of time, pressed gently together. The walls no longer reflect sound. They absorb it, as if every word ever spoken near this depth has already been forgiven. A path opens that is not straight. It curves slowly, following the logic of routes rather than roads. There are no markings. Nothing here needs to be labeled. The air carries a faint weight, not heaviness, presence, the kind that does not ask questions. This is where Veles works without being noticed. You begin to sense how this place functions. Nothing arrives suddenly. Nothing is taken away abruptly. Everything passes through, pauses, and settles. Even memory behaves differently. Thoughts that once felt sharp soften at the edges. They do not disappear. They become rounder, easier to carry. The passage widens again, opening into a low cavern where the ceiling dips close. Not threatening, protective. Here, the ground is warmer, not heat retention. As if the earth remembers what it has held. You notice traces of movement without seeing motion. A furred shape once rested here. Hooves paused. A body returned to soil in a way that felt natural. Nothing lingers in pain. This is not a place of endings. It is a place of rearrangement. Veles is present here as balance, as the agreement between surface and below, as the rule that nothing is wasted. Water appears again, wider now. A dark pool, perfectly still. Its surface does not reflect you. It reflects depth. You do not step into it. You do not need to. Across the pool, the cavern continues, but the quiet changes. It thickens slightly, as if layers are being stacked carefully. This is where old paths from the living world arrive. Not roads, habits, daily movements worn into time. Farmers once stood above this place without knowing. Animals passed over it. Children slept while this depth remained awake in its own way. Veles does not watch. Veles holds. The sound of water becomes less important as you move past it. The ground steadies. Your steps feel absorbed before they can echo. Further in, the cavern splits into 3 spaces that exist side by side, not separated by walls, by purpose. One holds bones, clean, undisturbed. One holds roots, thick, patient. One holds nothing visible at all. You are drawn to the third. Here, the darkness is not absence. It is storage without containers. This is where names dissolve, not erased, returned to a form that does not need sound. You sense how Veles governs without command. There are no rules written here, only patterns that repeat because they work. Return follows growth. Descent follows life. Quiet follows movement. Time loosens again. The idea of before and after becomes optional. You are not drifting. You are being allowed to remain. From this depth, the surface feels less like above and more like elsewhere, not distant, just no longer urgent. The world does not disappear when you leave it. It simply continues without asking you to participate. A low vibration passes through the ground, not sound, recognition. This place knows you are here, and it does not react. The cavern begins to slope downward again, more gently this time, as if preparing you for something broader. Roots thin into threads. Stone smooths. Water becomes memory rather than presence. Somewhere ahead, the deep systems connect. Paths of soil, paths of bone, paths of forgetting, all maintained without effort. This is the quiet beneath the Slavic world, not hidden, simply ignored by urgency. Veles remains, not as a figure at the end of the path, but as the path itself. You continue forward, carrying less than when you arrived, without having lost anything. The deeper layer is close now. The path continues downward. Not steeper, just older. The walls change again, losing their edges, becoming less like barriers and more like boundaries that agree to exist. Stone here does not press inward. It holds itself back. You notice that sound has almost completely stopped behaving as sound. Footsteps do not echo. Movement does not announce itself. Even the idea of noise feels unnecessary. This is a working depth, below the surface world, beneath the remembered forests. Systems operate without instruction. Cycles turn quietly. Transfers happen without ceremony. Veles is present here as continuity. The path narrows, not to restrict you, but to guide attention. The ceiling lowers until it feels close enough to be intentional, not enclosing, focusing. This is a corridor shaped by repetition rather than design. Hooves once passed here. Pause, bare feet, none at the same time, all at different times. The ground accepted each weight without preference. Nothing was judged by how it arrived. You feel the temperature stabilize. No warmth, no cold, a balanced middle where change slows down and settles. Roots appear again, but they are thinner now. Older, they no longer search. They simply exist, maintaining quiet connections between layers. Some of these roots do not lead upward anymore. They lead sideways, into memory, into soil that no longer remembers its origin. You pass beneath them without touching. The corridor opens gradually into a wide hollow space where the floor dips slightly, forming a shallow basin. No water collects here. It holds something else. Stillness, not absence, accumulation. This is where movements end when they no longer need to continue. You sense traces of countless returns, not bodies, not stories. Just the release that comes after function is complete. Veles governs this space without presence, without symbol. As gravity governs falling, no resistance is required. Along the edges of the basin, the ground is marked by faint impressions, not footprints, pressure memories, places where something rested long enough to be absorbed. Nothing here is waiting to rise again quickly. Time stretches differently in this chamber, not slower, broader. Moments are allowed to remain unfinished without becoming problems. You stand without effort. The idea of standing no longer includes tension. The ceiling above fades into darkness, but the darkness does not feel distant. It feels folded, layered, close in multiple directions at once. From here, the deep Slavic world spreads outward rather than downward. This is not the lowest place. It is a junction. From this basin, paths extend in several directions, but they are not visible all at once. They reveal themselves only as attention shifts. One path leads toward older earth, compacted before forests existed. Another slopes gently toward water that has never seen light. A third does not move through space at all. You are not drawn to choose yet. Veles does not guide by instruction. The system allows readiness to decide. You notice that memory behaves differently here. Thoughts arrive stripped of urgency. Images lose edges. Names lose attachment. Nothing is erased. Everything is simplified. This is how the deep keeps order without rules. The basin holds you for a time that cannot be counted. Above, seasons may have shifted. Below, nothing needs to acknowledge that change. The ground beneath you feels reliable, unmoving. It has supported countless endings without strain. You sense that this place exists beneath many worlds at once. Villages that rose and fell, paths that disappeared, lives that moved on without knowing this depth carried their weight quietly. Veles remains as keeper of what falls out of use, not discarded, reassigned. The air here feels dense with agreement, as if every layer above has already accepted the work done below. A subtle shift passes through the basin, not movement, readiness. One of the unseen paths begins to clarify, not brighter, clearer, as if it has been waiting for attention rather than permission. This path does not descend sharply. It widens. The ground ahead smooths. The texture changes from compacted earth to something closer to packed clay. Old riverbed material, shaped by pressure rather than flow. You begin moving again without deciding to. Behind you, the basin does not close. It simply resumes its function. Ahead, the space opens toward a deeper system, broader and quieter than before, a place where the idea of surface life becomes faint, not forgotten. Veles is still not seen, still not heard. Yet, everything here continues to work. The next layer is near now. The space ahead opens without announcing itself. It simply becomes wider than the idea of a path. The ground smooths beneath you, no longer shaped by footsteps or roots, but by long pressure and slow settling. This layer feels deliberate, as if the earth itself decided to remain stable here. You enter a vast underground expanse where distance loses meaning. The ceiling is not high, yet it feels immeasurable. The walls are not far, yet they do not confine. everything exists in balance. This is where the deep systems slow down. Here, the work of Veles is most complete, not active, not passive, maintained. You sense that this space was never discovered. It was never hidden either. It simply remained beneath attention, functioning without interruption. The air carries a faint mineral scent. Stone remembering water, soil remembering forests that no longer stand. Nothing sharp, nothing fresh. Everything aged into calm usefulness. As you move further, the ground subtly changes texture. Fine grains give way to compacted layers that feel almost polished. Not by hands, by time repeating itself without deviation. This is where the underground stops receiving and starts holding. You notice how weight behaves differently here. Each step feels lighter, not because you are supported more, but because effort is no longer required. Movement has become cooperative. Veles is present as permission. Permission for things to rest without purpose. Permission for cycles to pause without breaking. Around you, the darkness feels organized. Not uniform, but intentional. Certain areas absorb attention, while others fade gently, encouraging you to pass without lingering. You sense old pathways crossing through this space. Not roads, not tunnels, alignments, places where movement once made sense and then stopped. Nothing was abandoned here. It was concluded. Further in, the chamber narrows slightly, forming a long stretch where the walls draw closer, not to restrict you, but to quiet the space even further. The sound of your presence fades until it feels as if you are not producing sound at all. This is the depth where even silence becomes unnecessary. Thoughts that arrive here do not complete themselves. They settle halfway, becoming impressions rather than ideas. Memory loosens its grip, offering only what is needed. The Slavic world above continues its cycles. Seasons turn, fires burn, names are spoken and forgotten. But here, beneath all of that, the ground keeps the agreements intact. Nothing ends without being absorbed. You pass alongside a section of the chamber where the wall bears subtle marks, not carvings, not damage, patterns formed by repeated contact over centuries. Bodies leaning, loads resting, weight accepted. This was once a place of pause for those who moved between worlds. Not gods, not spirits, living beings following instinct, guided by quiet necessity. Veles held their passage without ceremony. As you continue, the chamber opens again, revealing a broad floor that slopes gently downward. The descent is so gradual it barely registers as movement. Yet the depth increases. The air becomes denser here, not heavy, but layered. Each breath feels like passing through strata rather than space. The idea of breathing becomes abstract. You sense that below this point, the underground begins to forget the surface entirely. Roots no longer appear. Bone no longer lingers. What remains is structure without story. This is where the deep Slavic world transitions from storage to foundation. Veles remains not as guardian, but as principle, the rule that nothing collapses inward, the reason the world above does not sink into itself. You feel the scale of this place expand sideways. It extends beneath rivers, beneath plains, beneath settlements that never knew this layer existed. The ground holds them all without strain. Time here is not slow. It is irrelevant. You pass through a section where the stone darkens, absorbing what little light your presence suggests. The walls feel smoother, more uniform, as if variation has been gradually worn away. This is where difference stops mattering. Movement becomes almost symbolic. Each step feels less like progression and more like acknowledgement. You are allowed to pass because nothing here resists passage. The chamber ahead widens again, revealing a long, low space where the floor is perfectly level. No dips, no rises, absolute balance. This is a stabilizing layer. Here, Veles completes the work of grounding. Weight is redistributed. Pressure is equalized. The deep adjusts itself so the world above remains unchanged. You notice faint vibrations passing through the ground at long intervals. Not tremors, corrections. Subtle recalibrations that keep everything aligned. Nothing dramatic ever happens here. And yet, without this place, nothing above could endure. You remain within this level longer than before. Time stretches outward, flattening. The idea of duration dissolves into presence. The silence here is not empty. It is full of function. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the ground begins to slope again. The change is so slight it feels like the space itself is guiding you forward. Ahead, the deep opens into another system. Broader, more abstract, less connected to the idea of Earth as surface. You sense that the next layer will move away from physical grounding and toward something older, something that existed before the need for form. Veles continues without interruption. You move onward, leaving the stabilizing chamber behind, not because it ends, but because it has done its work. The descent continues. The slope ahead becomes more deliberate. No longer something you almost miss, but something that invites continuation. The ground feels denser here, layered with decisions made long before choice existed. Each layer supports the next, not by force, but by agreement. This is Earth that knows its responsibility. You move deeper into a zone where the underground is no longer concerned with receiving or releasing. Its role here is endurance. The walls lose texture almost completely. Variations smooth out until stone becomes uniform, reliable, predictable. This is not erosion. It is refinement through time. Veles remains present as consistency. Nothing here reacts to you. Nothing acknowledges arrival or departure. This depth does not require awareness to function. The air grows quieter in a way that is difficult to describe. Not thinner, not heavier, simply settled. as if movement itself has learned to pause out of respect. You sense pressure from all directions, evenly distributed, not confinement, support. The feeling that collapse is impossible here. This is where the deep carries the weight of centuries without remembering individual years. You pass through a section where the chamber subtly curves, following the natural bend of the land above. Hills, valleys, rivers, all mirrored faintly in this underground alignment. The surface leaves an impression even when forgotten. Veles holds these impressions without interpretation. The floor beneath you is perfectly stable. No loose stone, no shifting ground. It feels engineered, though no hands shaped it. This is the result of time doing the same work repeatedly until perfection is no longer accidental. You realize that this layer does not belong to any single place. It stretches outward beneath regions that never met above ground. Cultures rose without knowing they shared this foundation. The Slavic world rests on this quiet without ceremony. Here, the idea of story dissolves almost entirely. Events do not leave marks. Consequences are absorbed and redistributed until they lose shape. This is not forgetting. It is resolution. As you continue, the space subtly darkens again, not because light is fading, but because contrast no longer exists. Everything blends into a single, steady presence. Movement becomes instinctive. You do not consider direction. The path makes itself apparent by allowing passage. Veles governs by removing friction. The chamber ahead opens into a long horizontal stretch, wider than before, flatter than any space you have encountered. This is a pressure corridor where forces equalize before moving onward. Here, the deep breathes in geological time. You sense distant vibrations, far below, far above, all passing harmlessly through this layer. Earthquakes lose urgency here. Weight disperses. Strain dissolves. Without this place, the world above would fracture. You remain within this corridor longer than expected. The idea of distance loosens. Progress becomes less important than presence. Nothing urges you forward, and yet, slowly, the far end of the corridor clarifies. Not brighter, defined. A transition rather than an opening. The ground begins to change again, almost reluctantly. The smoothness gives way to faint texture. Subtle variation returns. This signals a shift in function. You sense that the next layer will not be about holding, but about connection. Where the deep begins to communicate between systems rather than stabilizing them. Veles remains continuous through this change, not adapting, not adjusting, simply extending. You approach the threshold where foundation becomes network, where the underground stops being a single mass and begins to branch into quieter, more abstract pathways. The stabilizing corridor fades behind you, not closing, not ending, simply no longer necessary. Ahead, the deep prepares to unfold in a different way. The descent continues. The threshold ahead does not announce itself. It becomes noticeable only when the ground begins to respond differently to your presence. The surface beneath your steps is no longer perfectly neutral. It carries faint direction, a suggestion rather than a push. This is where the deep stops acting as a single body and begins to organize itself into relationships. You sense lines of quiet extending outward, not tunnels, not passages, but alignments, invisible paths where pressure, memory, and weight are exchanged between distant places. This layer does not hold the world above, it connects it. Veles continues here as coherence. The walls regain subtle variation, not roughness, identity. Each section of stone feels slightly distinct, as if it belongs to a different underground region, yet all are balanced together. You realize that beneath villages, beneath rivers, beneath forgotten clearings, these quiet connections already exist. The surface world appears divided. The deep is not. Movement here feels guided by balance rather than direction. You are carried along a route that exists because it reduces strain elsewhere. Passage itself is a form of maintenance. The air shifts again, carrying a faint sense of openness. Not space, but possibility. The underground begins to feel less like a place and more like a system. Veles governs this system without center. You pass alongside intersections where multiple alignments cross. Nothing marks them. Nothing pauses. Yet these are critical points where the deep redistributes weight, memory, and consequence. This is how the world avoids breaking. Time becomes almost meaningless now. Not stretched, not compressed, simply irrelevant. Processes here do not care how long they take, only that they complete. You feel yourself becoming lighter in a different way, not lifted, but unburdened by the need to orient yourself. Direction no longer matters. The path beneath you flattens once more, but not into stability, into readiness. Ahead, the underground opens into a quieter complexity, a region where paths multiply and overlap without collision, where the deep speaks to itself constantly without sound. You sense that the next layer will no longer feel like descent. It will feel like spreading outward. Veles remains continuous through all of this, not changing role, not assuming form, simply ensuring that everything below the Slavic world remains connected, absorbed, and balanced. The foundation is complete. The network waits. The story is ready to move beyond grounding. The descent gives way to depth without direction. The deep no longer feels like below. It feels like everywhere at once. You move forward without the sensation of descent. The ground remains level, yet the space around you expands in subtle directions, opening into a web of quiet passages that do not intersect in ways the surface world would recognize. This is the layer where underground becomes system. Here, distance is measured by influence rather than space. A shift in one place eases pressure in another. Weight moves without traveling. Memory relocates without leaving traces. Veles remains present as continuity across all of it. The walls no longer behave as boundaries. They are guides. Each curve, each subtle angle directs balance where it is needed. Stone here has learned how to listen. You notice that the air carries no particular quality now. It is neither cool nor dense. It simply exists as a medium through which the deep communicates with itself. Sound is entirely absent, yet awareness increases. You sense other regions connected to this one, far beneath riverbeds, beneath hills that never received names, beneath settlements erased so completely that even memory has let them go. All of them tied together here. This is where the underground equalizes the world. As you continue, the space subtly reorganizes itself around you, not in response to your presence, but in accordance with larger patterns. Passage aligns with function. Movement follows need. The ground beneath you shifts in texture again, becoming faintly granular, as if composed of countless compressed moments. Not sand, not soil, something finer. This is where accumulation becomes abstraction. You feel the absence of edges. The idea of corner or boundary no longer applies. Everything blends into a continuous field of quiet purpose. Veles governs this field without oversight. Nothing here needs to be corrected. The system corrects itself. You pass near a convergence where several alignments overlap. The quiet deepens slightly, not because something happens, but because equilibrium is achieved. Pressure resolves. Tension dissolves. The surface world will never notice this moment. Above, storms may pass. Fires may burn. Names may be spoken loudly. But here, the deep adjusts without drama. You realize that this layer does not belong to any single mythology. It predates stories. It persists beneath them. Veles exists here not as a figure remembered, but as a role fulfilled. The role of keeper of connections. Movement continues without effort. You do not decide where to go. You are carried along the path that requires your presence least. Friction has been minimized to zero. This is how the deep prefers movement. As you advance, you sense a gradual thinning, not emptiness, simplification. Layers of structure peel away until only the essential remains. The underground here is no longer concerned with earth as matter. It is concerned with order. Patterns repeat without repetition. Cycles complete without returning to the same point. Everything flows without direction. You feel yourself becoming less defined, not fading, aligning. Thoughts no longer arrive as sequences. They appear as impressions that dissolve as soon as they are understood. Memory becomes optional. Veles continues as permission for this state to exist. The space ahead grows quieter in a different way. Not deeper, not heavier, more refined, as if unnecessary complexity has been filtered out. This is where the underground approaches its most abstract form. You sense that beneath this layer, the idea of ground itself will begin to lose meaning. The deep will no longer resemble earth or stone or passage. It will become something closer to principle. You pause without stopping. The system holds you in balance, neither moving you forward nor drawing you back. Here, the Slavic world above feels distant not in space, but in relevance. The needs of the surface no longer dictate function at this depth. Veles remains steady and without presence, ensuring that the transition does not fracture. Gradually, the alignments around you begin to simplify further. Multiple paths merge into fewer, broader flows. Complexity gives way to clarity. The underground prepares to move beyond connection and into origin. You sense that the next layer will no longer manage what already exists. It will address what existed before existence required management. The ground beneath you becomes almost featureless, not smooth, undefined, as if form itself is becoming unnecessary. You continue forward, carried by the same quiet logic that has guided everything so far. The network does not end. It resolves. Ahead, the deep prepares to release structure entirely. The story moves closer to its earliest state. The deep does not open suddenly. It thins. What once felt structured now loosens its edges, not dissolving, but releasing the need to be shaped. The ground beneath you offers less resistance to definition, as if form itself has learned to step aside. You move forward without sensing movement, carried by continuity rather than direction. This layer is no longer concerned with balance between places. It addresses balance between states. Here, the underground forgets geography. Stone loses its insistence on being stone. Texture softens into suggestion. Surface becomes concept. The idea of ground remains, but the material meaning fades. Veles continues as allowance for systems to simplify without collapse. You notice that awareness widens again, not outward, but inward. Attention no longer settles on objects or spaces. It drifts across relationships that cannot be pointed to. Sound has no place here at all. Even the memory of silence feels unnecessary. This is where the deep stops storing and begins remembering why storage was needed. You sense traces of the world above not as images, but as pressures that once existed. Growth, decay, movement, rest, all reduced to their essential impulses. Nothing carries a name. Veles remains not as keeper, but as witness without observation. You pass through a region where the deep seems almost empty, yet not lacking. It feels prepared, ready to hold what has not yet been imagined. This space existed before the first settlement, before the first fire was controlled, before the idea of shelter separated inside from outside. It is not ancient, it is prior. The ground beneath you offers no feedback now. It does not feel firm or soft. It simply allows passage. Support is assumed. You sense that if you were to stop, the system would continue without noticing. Presence here does not alter function. This is the deepest courtesy of the underground. Veles governs by not intervening. As you continue, the surrounding quiet grows thinner still, not fading, but refining. Layers fall away until only the quiet that cannot be reduced remains. This is not emptiness. This is origin without beginning. You sense how the underground once learned to exist without instruction, how patterns formed without design, how stability emerged not from force, but from repetition that proved sufficient. Nothing here resists change. Nothing invites it either. The idea of time loosens completely. There is no earlier or later, only continuity unfolding without sequence. You feel yourself aligning with this rhythm, not adapting, but ceasing to resist it. Thoughts appear less frequently now. When they do, they are brief and unshaped. They dissolve before they can attach themselves to meaning. Memory continues to be optional. Veles remains as the quiet acceptance of this state. You sense that this layer supports not just the Slavic world above, but every world that has ever required ground beneath it. The deep does not distinguish between cultures. It predates distinction. Here, myth loses its structure and becomes atmosphere. You pass through a subtle transition where even alignment fades. The idea of path disappears entirely. There is no forward or back. Movement becomes presence. This is where the underground approaches its most reduced form, not compressed, but clarified. Everything unnecessary has been filtered away. The deep now resembles a rule that does not need to be stated, a condition that allows existence to continue without supervision. Veles is present as that condition. You sense that below this layer, nothing remains that could be called underground. The next state will not be beneath anything. It will be beneath definition. You pause without pausing. The system holds you without effort. Here, the surface world feels not distant, but irrelevant. Its urgency has no meaning at this depth. The quiet remains steady, uninterrupted, complete. Gradually, a subtle change begins to form, not in space, but in necessity. The deep prepares to reintroduce structure, not because it is needed here, but because something above will require it again. This is not ascent. This is preparation for return. Veles continues through the transition without shift or signal. The origin has been reached. What follows will not be deeper. It will be different. The story moves toward emergence. The change does not arrive as motion. It arrives as readiness. What was once reduced to principle begins to gather definition again. Not reversing, not returning, but preparing to express itself in a quieter form. You remain where you are, yet the deep around you starts to remember how to shape itself. This is not emergence into space. It is emergence into relation. The ground beneath you hints at texture once more, not fully formed, but suggested, as if structure is being invited back gently, without demand. Veles remains present as continuity through this shift. Nothing here is rebuilt from fragments. There are no pieces to assemble. Form returns as agreement rather than construction. You sense faint alignments beginning to reappear. Not paths, not corridors, but tendencies. Directions that exist only because balance favors them. This layer does not carry weight yet. It prepares for weight to exist. The quiet thickens slightly, not becoming heavy, but acquiring dimension. The absence of shape gives way to the possibility of shape. You notice how awareness begins to focus again, no longer spread evenly, but able to rest on subtle differences. Variation returns without urgency. This is where the deep relearns distinction. Stone has not returned, but the idea of stone has. Ground has not reformed, but the idea of ground begins to matter. You feel how the underground prepares to support something above it again. Not immediately, not suddenly, but inevitably. Veles governs this phase as patience. The system does not rush toward complexity. It allows simplicity to stretch until it naturally gives rise to form. You pass through a region where the deep feels almost unfinished. Not incomplete, but intentionally open, ready to accept future layers without resistance. This place will become foundation later, but for now, it remains possibility. Time resumes a faint presence here, not as sequence, but as anticipation. Change is no longer irrelevant. It is simply unhurried. You sense pressures from above beginning to matter again. Not weight, expectation. The future surface world has not arrived, but its need is already known. The deep listens. Veles remains as the quiet agreement to respond when response is required. Structure begins to organize itself in wide patterns, broad enough to remain gentle, precise enough to be reliable. The first outlines of underground order return. This is not a return to storage or balance or network. This is preparation for growth. You feel yourself carried along these forming tendencies, not pushed, not guided, but allowed to follow what is becoming possible again. The space around you feels less abstract now, still quiet, still soft, but no longer undefined. The idea of location slowly regains meaning, not here or there, but somewhere. You sense that above, far beyond this depth, the world will one day need roots again. It will need weight to rest upon. It will need quiet places beneath its movement. The deep prepares to answer that need long before it is spoken. Veles remains unchanged through all of this, not adapting, not shifting role. The keeper of what descends is also the keeper of what must rise. But nothing rises yet. The system continues its slow reorganization. Patterns widen, overlap, stabilize. Form returns without interrupting quiet. You move through a zone where the first distinctions appear. This is deeper than names, deeper than stories, but no longer beyond difference. Here, one direction feels subtly unlike another. The underground is remembering how to host variety. You pause again without stopping, held within this gentle forming state. The deep does not require your attention, yet it allows it. Everything remains calm. Nothing strains toward completion. The emergence continues at its own pace. Ahead, the forming layers begin to suggest future functions, places where weight will settle, places where movement will pass through, places where quiet will remain untouched. The deep prepares to become useful again. Veles continues, steady and unseen, ensuring that nothing forms too sharply, nothing collapses too quickly. The origin has passed. The foundation is being remembered. The story moves slowly toward return, without urgency, without direction, without sound. The forming layers continue to settle, not closing, not fixing themselves, but accepting the idea of function. What was once only potential begins to recognize purpose. Gently, without instruction, the ground beneath you gains a faint sense of direction again. Not pulling, not guiding, simply allowing movement to make sense. The deep is remembering how to be dependable. You move forward without effort. The space responds by clarifying itself around you. This layer is quieter than those before it, not because less exists, but because what exists has learned restraint. Veles remains present as restraint itself. The underground here does not rush to become solid. It tests balance first. Pressure is distributed slowly. Weight is imagined before it is accepted. You sense the earliest outlines of chambers forming, not hollow spaces, but intentions, places where stillness will be preserved, even when movement returns above. This is where rest is planned long before it is needed. The air regains a subtle density, not heaviness, definition. Awareness can now settle without dissolving. You notice the return of distance, not far and near, but separation that allows things to exist beside one another without blending. Difference becomes possible again. Stone has not yet arrived, but firmness has. The idea of support strengthens. Veles governs this layer as discretion. Nothing forms unless it must. Nothing remains unless it serves quiet. You pass through a broad region where the underground feels patient rather than active. It is no longer abstract. It is no longer origin. It is preparation refined. The deep anticipates roots before roots exist. You sense how future forests will depend on this layer, how soil will need somewhere to rest, how water will require paths that do not collapse. The deep accepts these responsibilities without awareness of reward. Time feels present again here, faint but noticeable, not ticking, accumulating. You move through areas where the forming ground subtly varies. Some sections feel more receptive, others more resistant. These differences will later define flow and rest. For now, they simply coexist. Veles remains as the quiet agreement between them. You feel the underground practicing stability. Small adjustments, pass through the forming structure. Corrections made before error can occur. Nothing dramatic happens. This is how endurance is built. The space around you now feels unmistakably like somewhere, not everywhere. Location returns without limitation. You sense boundaries beginning to appear, not walls, but thresholds, points where one state gives way to another. This is where the underground learns to separate without isolating. Movement remains easy, unforced. The path exists because the ground allows it, not because it has been carved. You realize that this layer will one day hold memory again. Not abstract memory, but the traces left by living movement. For now, it remains clean. Veles holds this cleanliness carefully. The quiet here is different from the quiet of origin. It is not absolute. It is expectant. You pause without stopping, aware that the deep is almost ready to receive the surface world again. The forming chambers ahead suggest shelter, not refuge from danger. Refuge from excess. Places where the world above will release what it cannot carry. The underground prepares to serve again. You sense that the next layer will bring substance back fully. Stone will return, roots will return, water will return, but all of it will arrive into a space that has already learned how to remain calm. Veles remains steady through this nearing transition. The preparation is nearly complete. The deep is ready to become beneath once more. The story continues toward substance. Slowly, without strain, substance returns without announcement. Not arriving, but being permitted. What was once only outline now accepts weight, carefully, without tension. The deep does not rush to become solid. It remembers how collapse happens and chooses patience instead. You feel the ground beneath you gain certainty, not hardness, reliability. Support is no longer imagined. It is present. Stone begins to exist again, not sharply, not freshly. It forms as if it has always been there, waiting for the right moment to matter. Veles remains as the quiet authority that allows matter to settle without conflict. The underground now resembles a place once more, not abstract, not symbolic. Chambers begin to take shape where stillness can remain intact, even as movement returns above. You move forward through a widening space where walls define themselves gently. No edges cut the quiet. Everything curves just enough to hold without enclosing. This is where the deep becomes hospitable. The air carries a familiar density again. Cool, grounded. Awareness no longer drifts. It rests. You sense the return of gravity's full attention. Weight matters again. Pressure is real, but nothing strains under it. The underground accepts responsibility. Roots have not yet arrived, but the ground prepares for them. Fine channels form where future growth will travel downward. These paths do not intrude. They negotiate space calmly. Water begins to return as possibility, not flow, not sound. The deep remembers how to guide it gently, preventing erosion before it can begin. Veles governs this return as moderation. You pass through a chamber where stone meets stone without friction. No seams show. Time has already smoothed every joint. This place will hold memory again one day, but for now, it remains neutral, clean, unclaimed. The quiet here is steady rather than vast. It feels dependable, like a room prepared before anyone enters. You sense how future lives will pass above this layer without knowing. Footsteps, fires, names, all supported by this unseen calm. The underground resumes its role beneath story. You move deeper into a network of forming chambers, each different in proportion, each aligned to reduce strain. The deep has learned where weakness forms and avoids it instinctively. Nothing is reinforced unnecessarily. Veles remains present as efficiency without force. Time continues its slow return here. Not urgent, not pressing. The idea of sequence becomes useful again. You notice faint currents moving through the stone. Not water, not air. Adjustments. Micro-corrections that keep everything balanced. This is how the deep maintains itself. The chambers ahead grow larger, broader, capable of holding more than stillness. One day, these spaces will absorb sound again. For now, they remain quiet. You sense the earliest traces of downward movement from above. Not roots yet, intention. The surface world prepares to connect. The deep receives this preparation without reaction. Veles holds the threshold between above and below open without invitation. Stone darkens slightly as density increases. This layer is stronger than those before it. It must be. It will carry weight that does not know it is being carried. You feel the underground align itself beneath future paths, future settlements, future forgetting. The calm here is practical. You pass through a long chamber where the ceiling lowers gradually, not pressing, but focusing attention. The walls curve inward just enough to guide movement without directing it. This space feels designed, yet no design occurred. The deep learned what works by lasting. You sense how stories will one day form above this place. Myths will speak of underworlds and guardians. Names like Veles will be used to describe what was always functioning without name. Here, Veles exists as role rather than symbol, the keeper of descent, the holder of what returns, the balance beneath growth. You continue forward, and the ground feels increasingly familiar. This is no longer origin or abstraction. This is the deep the surface world depends on. Roots begin to appear faintly now, not fully formed, just suggestions of direction. The underground offers them safe passage. Water begins to gather in narrow channels. Slow, controlled, the deep guides it away from collapse. The system resumes full function. You move through a region where the underground feels complete. Not finished, complete, ready to endure. Here, nothing changes quickly. This layer will outlast countless surface cycles without effort. Veles remains steady. You pause without stopping, aware that the deep has fully returned to substance. What lies ahead is not deeper, but more familiar, the place where underground meets life again. The chambers ahead begin to open upward slightly, not toward light, toward connection. You sense the surface world drawing closer, not in distance, in relevance. The deep prepares to receive movement again. Stone is firm now. Structure is reliable. Quiet is intact. The long cycle has turned. You stand within the completed underground, beneath forests yet to grow, beneath names yet to be spoken. Veles remains below it all, unseen, unchanged. The story approaches the final layers, where stillness and life coexist. The descent has become foundation. The quiet endures. The underground now carries weight without effort, not noticing the burden, not reacting to it. Stone has settled into certainty, and certainty no longer needs attention. You move forward through this completed depth, where structure and quiet exist together without conflict. Nothing here strains toward change. Everything is prepared to last. This is where the deep resumes its long duty. The chambers around you feel familiar in a way that does not rely on memory. Their proportions make sense instinctively. Curves guide without instruction. Openings allow passage without invitation. The underground has remembered how to host life above it. Veles remains present as steadiness. Roots now begin to appear clearly, descending from a surface that has not yet fully arrived, yet already presses gently downward. They do not break the stone. They are received. The deep allows them passage, shaping channels just wide enough, just firm enough to prevent damage. Growth is negotiated quietly. Water follows next, slowly, carefully. It does not rush. It does not carve. It is guided along paths prepared long before it arrived. This is how erosion is avoided. You sense how the underground has learned from countless cycles. Where collapse once happened, reinforcement now exists. Where pressure once accumulated, release has been planned. Nothing here is accidental. You move through a long corridor that runs beneath what will one day be a river. The stone above you is shaped to distribute weight evenly. The water will pass without knowing how carefully it is being held. Veles governs this cooperation without presence. The quiet here is practical, not vast, not abstract. It is the quiet of systems that work. You notice subtle differences between chambers now. Some feel denser, some more open. These variations will matter later. They will determine where roots cluster, where water lingers, where ground remains dry. For now, they simply exist. Time flows more normally here, not measured, but acknowledged. Change will occur, but slowly enough to be absorbed. You sense the surface world becoming active again, not loud, not urgent, simply alive. Animals will move above this place. Fires will be lit. Settlements will form and dissolve. None of that will disturb the deep. The underground is ready. Veles remains as the keeper of this readiness. You pass through a chamber where the ceiling bears faint, natural ridges, not markings, stress lines that have been resolved, evidence of pressure managed successfully. This place has already survived. The air here feels settled, not stale, balanced. It circulates through hidden paths, maintaining stability without movement being noticed. The deep breathes without lungs. Roots thicken as you move onward. They branch, intertwine, and descend further, trusting the underground to hold them. The ground does not resist. Water begins to collect in broader channels now, slow pools forming in places designed to hold them. These will one day feed streams. For now, they remain calm and dark. You sense how life above will depend on this unseen patience. The chambers ahead widen slightly, creating spaces where the underground accepts excess. Excess water, excess pressure, excess memory. This is where imbalance is absorbed. Veles governs this absorption quietly. You move through a region where the deep feels almost generous. Space is provided without being demanded. Stability is offered without cost. The surface world will never repay this. Stone here is firm, but not brittle. It flexes just enough to prevent fracture. This quality has been earned through time, not design. You feel how the underground has become resilient rather than rigid. The quiet here is no longer absolute. Faint sounds from above begin to register. Distant movement, life stirring. They do not intrude. The deep filters them gently. You sense that this layer exists closest to the living world, not touching it, supporting it. The distance between above and below has narrowed to purpose. Veles remains unchanged through this proximity. You pass beneath an area where future dwellings will stand. The ground prepares to bear repeated weight. Footsteps will come and go. The stone will not complain. This is where endurance becomes invisible. The underground continues its work without awareness of being relied upon. It does not expect recognition. It does not seek to be named. Names will come later. You move onward through a final sequence of chambers where structure, water, and root systems coexist in balanced arrangement. Nothing dominates. Everything negotiates. This is the completed deep. Here, the Slavic world above will unfold for generations. Stories will be told. Gods will be named. Myths will describe underworlds and guardians. But beneath all of that, this quiet system will continue unchanged. Veles remains as role, not figure. The keeper of what descends. The holder of what returns. The balance beneath growth. You pause without stopping, sensing that the descent has ended in function rather than depth. Ahead, the underground transitions fully into the familiar beneath. The place where stillness and life overlap daily. The story moves toward its final layers. The deep is complete, and it will remain so. The underground does not change its purpose. it refines it. What you move through now is not a new layer, but a matured one, a depth that has learned how to remain unnoticed while carrying everything that depends on it. You pass beneath ground that has already accepted countless days and nights. Weight has come and gone. Pressure has shifted and settled, and the stone has learned exactly how much to give. This is where endurance becomes routine. Veles remains present as reliability. Roots now occupy their intended roots, thicker where strength is needed, thinner where passage must remain open. They do not struggle. The underground has prepared space for them patiently. Water moves in quiet channels, guided by slopes too subtle to see, slowing before it can erode, pooling where nourishment will later be drawn upward. Nothing competes here. The chambers you move through are no longer forming. They are functioning. Each curve distributes force. Each hollow absorbs excess. The system maintains itself without correction. You sense how the deep anticipates seasons before they arrive. Rain will fall. Frost will come. Heat will press downward. The underground has already adjusted. This is foresight without thought. Veles governs this readiness without awareness. You move beneath an area where future paths will cross. Repeated footsteps will compress the soil. The stone below has reinforced itself quietly, preventing collapse before strain can accumulate. The underground accepts repetition. The quiet here is layered, not uniform. Some spaces are deeper, meant to hold what must remain still. Others are lighter, allowing subtle movement to pass through. These distinctions matter. You feel how memory returns here in a practical way. Traces remain not as stories, but as adjustments. Pressure remembered, weight accounted for. Nothing personal persists. This is where the deep supports life without recording it. You pass beneath a region where fire will one day burn above. Heat will press downward briefly. The stone here is prepared to absorb and release it evenly. The underground has learned to tolerate disturbance without reacting. Veles remains steady through all disturbance. The air moves through unseen corridors. Slow circulation that prevents stagnation without creating sound. Balance is maintained quietly. The deep breathes without needing rhythm. You notice how the chambers gradually become smaller, closer to the surface. The space narrows not to confine, but to strengthen. Support increases as distance to life above decreases. This is intentional. The underground knows where it must be strongest. You sense how the surface world draws near, not physically, but functionally. The needs of living systems begin to shape the deep more directly. The underground responds without resistance. Veles continues as agreement. You move through a passage where the stone shows faint stress patterns, not cracks, successful redistributions, evidence of pressure met and resolved. This place has endured without incident. Roots intertwine overhead, their weight shared evenly across prepared channels. They feed on what the underground offers without depleting it. Water seeps slowly nearby, guided away from collapse zones, directed toward places that will sustain growth. Everything works. The quiet here is no longer absolute. Faint impressions from above register softly. Footsteps, distant movement, life in motion. They are filtered, softened, absorbed. The deep protects itself and the world above simultaneously. You pass beneath ground that will one day hold structures. The stone below adjusts its density slightly, ensuring stability before the first foundation is laid. This is preparation that goes unseen. Veles governs these adjustments without command. The underground now feels unmistakably like beneath. No longer abstract, no longer origin. It has returned fully to its role as support. You move through a final sequence of functional chambers, places designed to catch excess, to hold imbalance, to prevent fracture. This is where failure is quietly prevented. You realize that this depth will outlast every story told above it. Names will change, beliefs will fade. The underground will remain unchanged. Veles exists here as continuity beyond myth, the keeper of descent, the holder of return, the balance beneath movement. You pause without stopping, aware that the deep has completed its long cycle from origin to foundation. Ahead, the remaining layers will bring you closest to the surface, where underground and life exist in daily contact. The story approaches its final movements. The quiet holds and continues. The distance between below and above grows thinner, not in space, but in responsibility. You move through depths that feel attentive now, not aware, attentive. The underground listens to what the surface requires without waiting to be asked. This is where support becomes precise. The chambers here are smaller, more deliberate. Each curve serves a function. Each hollow absorbs a specific kind of strain. Nothing is decorative. Nothing is excessive. Veles remains present as calibration. Roots are fully present now, woven into their channels with care. They do not force their way through stone. The stone has already yielded where yielding is safe. Growth and ground cooperate. Water moves close by, guided through narrow passages that prevent pressure from building. It slows before it can pool too deeply. It releases before it can overflow. The underground regulates without appearing to act. You sense how daily life above presses downward constantly. Footsteps, tools, animals, structures. The deep receives all of it without fatigue. This is endurance refined. The quiet here is practical and layered. Some spaces remain untouched, preserving stillness. Others allow movement to pass through gently, filtering impact before it spreads. These layers work together. Veles governs their coordination without hierarchy. You move beneath land that has already forgotten earlier versions of itself. Forests that once stood have returned to soil. Clearings have closed. paths have vanished. The underground remembers only what matters. Stone shows subtle differences here, not flaws, adaptations. Where pressure increased, density followed. Where release was needed, space was allowed. The deep has learned to adjust continuously without disruption. You pass beneath a place where people will gather, weight will concentrate. The underground below has strengthened itself in advance, redistributing force outward. This is foresight without intention. Veles remain steady. Air flows through hidden channels, slow enough to be unnoticed, sufficient enough to prevent stagnation. Balance is maintained without sound. The deep breathes by design, not rhythm. You feel the closeness of the surface now, not as nearness, as interaction. The underground responds directly to what happens above it. Rain will fall. The deep prepares to receive it. Frost will form. The deep prepares to hold warmth. Heat will press downward. The deep prepares to distribute it. Nothing surprises this layer. You move through a narrow passage where the stone curves tightly. This is a reinforcement corridor designed to carry repeated stress without weakening. Here, the underground anticipates habit, feels governs habit without judgment. Roots thicken overhead, branching where nourishment is richest. The deep allows this without surrendering stability. Channels widen slightly, then hold. Water gathers briefly nearby, then moves on. Nothing lingers long enough to damage. The system corrects itself continuously. The quiet here is not absolute. It is resilient. Disturbance passes through and is absorbed. You sense that this depth is the closest companion to life above. It works constantly, invisibly, ensuring that the surface can afford to be careless. The underground carries that burden willingly. Veles remains as permission for care to occur without recognition. You pass beneath ground that will one day be dug. Tools will enter the soil. Stone will be cut. The deep has already identified where disruption can be tolerated. Other areas remain protected. Nothing essential is exposed. You feel the underground drawing firm boundaries here. Not walls, limits, places where intrusion ends and preservation begins. This is discernment. The chambers grow simpler again as you move onward. Complexity gives way to strength. The deep focuses on holding rather than adjusting. The surface world presses closer in relevance. Daily movement above registers clearly now, though still softened. Footsteps become faint pulses. Activity becomes distant vibration. The deep absorbs it all. You pause without stopping, aware that this layer represents the closest sustained partnership between life and stillness. Veles continues as the quiet agreement between them. The underground has completed its return from origin, from abstraction, from preparation. What remains is maintenance. Ahead, the final layers approach, places where underground and surface almost touch, where stillness becomes background to life. The story moves toward its quiet conclusion. The deep remains and continues. The underground no longer needs to adjust. It maintains. You move through depths that have settled into routine. Not repetition. Routine. The kind that does not dull because it is necessary. Here, beneath the Slavic world, everything has found its correct amount of effort. Veles remains present as steadiness. Roots pass above you constantly now. Some old, some new. The deep recognizes which must be supported and which must be redirected. Nothing grows without consideration. Water follows its quiet paths, guided away from collapse, released before it accumulates. The underground knows exactly how much it can hold. This layer exists closest to daily life. Footsteps pass above. Weight comes and goes. Seasons press downward in familiar patterns. The deep accepts all of it. Stone here is firm beyond question. It has been tested by time, corrected by pressure, and simplified by endurance. Nothing unexpected remains. You sense how little attention this place requires. The system no longer needs awareness. It functions because it has already learned everything necessary. Veles governs this learned balance. The quiet here is not deep or vast. It is dependable. The kind of quiet that allows everything else to be loud. You pass beneath ground that will continue to change above. Fields turning to settlements. Settlements returning to soil. None of this disrupts what lies below. The underground remains neutral. You pause without stopping, aware that nothing further needs to be explained at this depth. The role has been fulfilled. What remains is continuation. The deep does not wait. It simply holds. There is no final threshold, only familiarity. The underground beneath the Slavic world continues exactly as it should. Unseen, unnamed, relied upon without question. You move through the last layer without sensing movement at all. Presence is enough. Direction has lost importance. This is where the deep and the surface coexist quietly. Veles remains not as guardian or figure, but as principle made permanent. The reason descent does not mean loss. The reason return does not mean disruption. Above, life continues to change. Below, the deep does not. Roots grow and release. Water passes and leaves. Weight arrives and departs. Everything is accepted and redistributed without memory. The underground has no need to record what it supports. Stone holds. Soil settles. Quiet remains. This is the agreement beneath the world. You sense that nothing here requires your attention anymore, not because it is empty, but because it is complete. The deep does not close behind you. It simply continues without you. Veles remains, steady and unnoticed, carrying the weight of endings, returns, and continuations without distinction. The Slavic world above will speak of gods, spirits, stories. Beneath all of that, this quiet system endures. Nothing asks for belief. Nothing seeks recognition. The deep remains what it has always been and will remain.